Welcome to the Knowledge Problem Podcast. The objective of this podcast is to engage policy professionals over thought-provoking and sometimes sensitive topics. We aim to bring these professionals together in a way that does not feed into the tribalist narratives plaguing society today. It is my hope, and the hope of all involved in this endeavor, that by allowing these ideas to contend and challenge each other with mutual respect, everyone who listens will learn something not previously considered.
The opinions and views of all guests do not necessarily reflect the views of the Knowledge Problem or of anyone involved in its production.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Pilkington, and on this special Pride Month episode, we are exploring LGBTQ Politics 2020 and beyond. Joining us, we have pundits Bradley Polumbo and Randy Slovacek. If you want to get started with introducing yourself, Randy, if you want to go first.
My name is Randy Slovacek, and I am an LGBTQ journalist. I've been writing my own blog, therandyreport.com, since 2011, and that progressed into branching out into other media outlets for entertainment, like ET Online. I also write for print magazines here in Las Vegas, Nevada, where I live. And then 2 years ago, I started writing full-time for InstinctMagazine.com. Where I cover primarily political news and hard news, but I also write other things depending on what the daily news cycle is like. And that's about it. I've been with my husband. Let me mention that because I noticed in the notes, tell us a little bit about yourself. I've been with my husband 25 years. We were married in 2003, and life's really good. As good as it can be in these crazy days.
So true. Brad, how about yourself?
Yeah, awesome. My name is Brad Polumbo. I am a libertarian-conservative journalist based in Washington, D.C. I just finished a media and journalism fellowship with the conservative magazine, The Washington Examiner, and I do editorial and opinion writing. I've also written for outlets like National Review, USA Today, and The Daily Beast. And I live in an apartment in Arlington with my boyfriend.
Oh, wonderful. First question I kind of want to ask you guys is, what kickstarted your career in covering LGBTQ issues?
I was always that guy that when people wanted someone to write a letter to the editor or they wanted someone to write a letter to someone, I was the guy that would end up being, hey, Randy, why don't you do that? And along the same time, I would go to parties, and I'm a news junkie. I always have been. I've been curious my entire life. As my friends will tell you, my favorite question is to ask why or how. And my friends will always say, why do you have to know? And I just do. I've been curious my entire life. So that led me to waking up in the morning, and my quiet time, my first hour or two of the day, is always reading the news, reading several news outlets, from Fox News to CNN to MSNBC to USA Today to the New York Times to the Washington Examiner, because I want to understand as much as I can about different angles. And then that led me to discover LGBTQ blogs back in the late 2000s. And coupled with my curiosity, it was just became a regular thing for me to read and devour all this information. And then in 2011, my husband in January 2011 said, well, you should write your own blog. And as I joke with people today, I always say, oh, great, so two people will read it, and it'll be kind of sad, my husband and myself. And at the end of the first month, there were several hundred readers. I'd share it on Facebook, and my friends would come and read. And then within about a year or two, it grew to 200,000 followers at the Randy Report. And then that led to me joining the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, and I started meeting more people. And that led to me writing for other outlets like Instinct Magazine and LGBTQ Nation and Queer Tea and all of that. So that's what led me into it. And I've always had a passion for politics and understanding it. I always want to understand both sides of an equation. So that's what got me to this point.
So for me, it was definitely a different story, but I first got interested in journalism as kind of a side thing in college. I, at the student fair freshman year, got recruited to come write for the campus paper, And I found most interesting the opinion page. So I started writing as a columnist, and then later I joined the staff as an editor before I was eventually fired at the behest of a mob. So that's funny. And maybe that's a story for another time. But I found essentially that I was very iconoclastic, and I really enjoyed starting conversations and sharing opinions that I sincerely held, even when they were radically out of the mainstream within that environment, which was a leftist college campus. I went to UMass Amherst, which has the distinction of being the only Marxist economics department in the country, completely Marxist. So that just gives you a good sense of what the campus is like. So I started writing columns, and I don't think I actually wrote about LGBT issues then, but it's what got me started on opinion writing and wanting to be a columnist. And when you're young and you're first getting started, you kind of have to focus on things where you are able to offer something unique. And I didn't know enough about politics. Now I write about 2020, I write about policy, I write about economics, all sorts of stuff. I still also write about LGBT issues because I care about them. But at the time, it was one of those things where I didn't have a lot of unique to say on most issues, but I sure as heck had a lot of unique things to say on LGBT issues, coming at it from the perspective of a gay person who was fairly conservative politically and rejected most of the tenets of kind of the mainstream LGBT crowd. Totally not represented in any of the leftist LGBT media. And so what actually happened is that I started writing about these things and putting out dissident points of view, and I started getting an outpouring of private support. I mean, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but roughly 20% of gay people are politically conservative or vote Republican, and most just don't speak out about it. So I can't tell you how many thousands of DMs I've gotten saying, hey, I agree with everything you said. I didn't know there were any gay journalists that thought like I did. And that's the stuff that's kept me going. What originally got me into it, covering that issue, was just the ability to have something unique to say, which lends itself to getting published more easily. But now that I've kind of established myself as a journalist, I still do it because I think it's important. And because there's an audience there that's desperately underserved by the mainstream LGBT community.
Brad, you spoke on holding a dissident point of views from the mainstream LGBT community, and I was just wondering, how did you both come from different sides of the political spectrum, and Brad, you're even more unique with having a more libertarian bent. And I was wondering, how did you come to hold the political beliefs you have currently, and was there a significant event that caused those beliefs?
No. What's interesting is I actually think that the political beliefs came first, and kind of the comfortable / conscious acceptance of the gay identity came later, right? So I would watch Fox News in high school, and I tended to move on from that in college, but I kind of just always had a right-leaning skew to how I perceive politics, even though I grew up with a mother who was a Democrat and a father who was a Republican, so I was exposed to both sides. But that was kind of my natural predisposition. And then I kind of politically came of age in a post-Obergefell era where the Republican Party, at least on the biggest issues that matter the most, had basically declared a ceasefire, especially with the selection of Donald Trump as a presidential nominee. So I never really felt like I'm friends with some gay conservatives who are in their 40s or 50s, and they talk about how they always believed in the Second Amendment and capitalism and the Constitution and all these things. But for a long time, being gay made them feel really unwelcome in the party, and they felt like it was really difficult to be gay and a Republican or be gay and conservative. There are still certainly some challenges and some major progress that needs to be made, but it is miles different than it once was. And so that's why I think I was able to kind of flow into that, even though I was coming to grips with my identity. So that happened during the college years as I got more politically involved and aware.
Let me say this. I can't point to a certain event that led me to my political leaning, but I will say, growing up in Texas, in Fort Worth, Texas, my father was a Republican, and owned his own business. And back then, really being a Republican was about financial and business concerns and everything, at least the way my father would always address it to me. The social side of the Republican Party that we see today sometimes that may have a problem with perhaps the LGBT community or not, racial issues didn't enter my household. That wasn't a thing, even though there I was in Fort Worth, Texas in the 70s. My mother passed away when I was very young, when I was 5, and because my father worked so much at his own business, I was raised in great part by a black family in town. I went on family vacations with them. It was my best friend's family, and I called my best friend's mother. The father of the family, Coach Robert Hughes, is the winningest high school basketball coach in the history of the United States, and which is pretty cool. And he's in the Basketball Hall of Fame. And I called Coach, because that's what you do in Texas. But this was the family that instilled a lot of values in me, and also not only the values, but what I saw and witnessed as a young blonde boy in Texas, and how this prominent black family was treated, and sometimes, often, experienced racism and injustice. They weren't wealthy, but he, being the high school basketball coach of the prominent black public high school in Fort Worth, he won state competitions all the time, so we'd go to state. And I just witnessed a lot of injustice through that. And then as I realized I was gay and became active as an openly gay man, you become aware of how political issues are treated for the LGBTQ community. And it just became a natural thing that I felt I was represented by a more liberal position or a Democratic Party. And I felt like the Republican Party wasn't reaching out to me. I realized the financial positions and the economic positions of the Republican Party, and I'm kind of moderate about those things, actually. I don't argue too much about those things, but it was really the social issues that really led me to a liberal leaning.
Moving on to politics today, especially like regarding the 2020 election, and Randy, you spoke on some racial issues, and with the protesting going on, maybe we could speak on a little bit about how Pride was originally a protest. Donald Trump, Joe Biden, if you guys have any opinions on like the 2020 political atmosphere.
Sure. Brad?
You go ahead.
Oh, sure. I am supporting Joe Biden. I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump, but I do encourage everyone to vote. I think everyone should vote. I've never missed an election since I turned 18. I voted in every election I can. I'm kind of traditional that way. I look at this election and I find the country, if we're going to talk politics, my personal opinion is I find the country extremely divided. I don't think that's news to anyone, and I think these protests that we're seeing in the streets over this past week reflect that. And one of the things that I think the country really needs is, and this is my opinion, is someone who is a leader, but also someone who can relate and be empathetic and show empathy to the American people. For instance, when Donald Trump recently finally addressed the killing of George Floyd, he spent seconds on the actual passing, and then it turned to the violence that we're seeing. And by the way, about the protests and the violence, let's just get this out of the way. I do not in any way support any violence in any protests. I'm an absolute believer in peaceful protests, and I'm heartened by seeing the police officers across the country who are taking a knee with protesters, and the police chief in Houston speaking out so forcefully about, let us do our job. This is Houston. This is our city. I support all of the peaceful protests, but I think we need someone who could bring the country together, who could address this. I was disappointed that while it's not really his milieu, Trump didn't even seem to try to address the racial aspect, the pain that the country is feeling right now. That was my perception. And so what I think after these past 3.5 years is I just think the country needs a less divisive president. And also, as an LGBTQ person, I just feel that he has not been a good influence for the LGBTQ community on several fronts. And so I know that Joe Biden will be better on those things for the community. And I also am heartened by the fact that Joe has said he's going to pick a woman running mate. And I really would like to see the White House reflect more of the country. And I think it's time we do have a female vice president. I'd like to see a female president. I'd like to see a black female president. I'd like to see more diversity in government. I really would. I would like our government to reflect the country.
Right. So my disposition on the 2020 election is very different. I was definitely a conscientious objector to Donald Trump in 2016, and I still will not vote for him for a number of reasons. I'm kind of in an interesting place where the biggest issues I have with Trump, people would be like, oh, because you're gay. No, it's because I'm a libertarian on free trade and immigration. And then general issues about his character and how he conducts himself. So I will probably vote. I was going to vote for Justin Amash when he was briefly running, but then I will write in or vote third party. I can't imagine a scenario in which I would vote for Joe Biden. And that's not because I think he's evil or something, but just because he's not representative of my beliefs or values on policies on 90% of them. And I also don't see him as a unifier. I guess is he less divisive than Trump? Sure. But 2 weeks ago, he told black people they aren't really black if they don't vote Democrat. So the idea that he's going to unite the country, to me, seems totally far-fetched. And I think it's an interesting point you bring up about the LGBT question, because the barriers I have to voting for Trump have nothing to do with LGBT. I think he's been the best Republican in a lifetime on LGBT issues. And has he been perfect? Absolutely not. I think the transgender military ban in particular is a serious problem. But in terms of overall, I mean, he entered office supportive of gay marriage. He launched an international campaign to decriminalize homosexuality. He appointed high-ranking judges and officials who are openly gay. He is not someone who particularly cares one way or the other. I mean, I have many gay friends who have met him and have talked to him about this issue. And the general disposition is that he is very neutral. Then a lot of times.
Not to interrupt, Brad, but I want to say I do agree with you on that. I don't think he hates or has a negative agenda towards the LGBTQ community. I don't. I think he has no core about it, and that's part of the problem. I think his positions on LGBTQ issues stem from winning in politics. I think he responds to whatever looks like people support him. You know, you mentioned that, and I don't mean to cut you off, but you mentioned him coming in supporting marriage equality. The quote was he was fine with it, fine with same-sex marriage.
That's a lot better than Barack Obama in 2012 or 2008.
Right. But here's the thing about that. You know, I know a lot of people bring that up. My position on all these things is society evolves. And if we always worried about what someone did 20 years ago specifically, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, we have to allow society to evolve. And so at the time, I didn't think, in 2008, I didn't see marriage equality coming quite so soon. That said, marriage equality did get supported by Barack Obama and Joe Biden.
Only once the polls changed for a majority support.
Okay, but it changed.
Yeah, but that
they
shows
supported it.
that shows the same criticism you're making of Trump could also apply to them. They changed because it was politically expedient.
Right, but not quite, because being fine with same-sex marriage sounds like he's tolerating it. I know people point to the fact that he held up a rainbow flag at a rally in Colorado, and that was really held up as this great moment. He held the flag up upside down. It was scrawled with, and I think this is important because you remember there was a message on the flag, right?
Yeah. And what was it? Gays for Trump?
It said LGBTs for Trump. And when you look at him, he takes the flag and he holds it for 27 seconds. And what he sees is LGBTs for Trump. He didn't say Trump for LGBTs. The message on the flag and the thing that he seemed to embrace was, these people are supporting me, and so I like that. And so I take the flag and I hold it and then I smile. I don't think he hates us. I don't think he really likes us that much. I think the transgender ban, I don't think he hates transgender people. People forget a lot that the transgender ban by Donald Trump actually happened because Republican congressmen and women wanted to not fund gender reassignment surgeries for military service members. And they went to Donald Trump and they said, we won't support funding your wall if we don't get this. And so suddenly, next thing you know, he announces, with the support of my generals, I'm going to ban transgender service members. And it was a surprise to the generals. And speaking to the Republican politicians that they went to him, they were even surprised that he went so far. It was a knee-jerk reaction. They just didn't want to fund gender reassignment surgeries, and suddenly it's a complete ban on transgender people. And so I want to repeat, I don't think he hates people. I just think he has reactions, visceral reactions to things, and whatever seems to benefit him. He knew he needed the money for the wall because he campaigned so hard on it. He had to have that money. So whatever they asked him for, he was going to give them. And I understand that that's politics. But I don't think the bias that's been shown to the LGBTQ community under the Trump-Pence administration is necessary. Well, Pence is another thing when we know that. But Trump, I just think he is following his own political instincts to get reelected.
So let me make 2 points here. One is that, so first I'll just briefly touch on the transgender military ban. I've written at least 3 columns explaining why it doesn't make sense, trying to make that case to a conservative audience. But I also, people tend to cite it as if it's evidence of Trump and the Trump-Pence administration, as you put it, being some wicked, evil, anti-LGBTQ oppressive government. I always I laugh at that a little, and I have a hard time taking it seriously, right? Because this is the same policy that Obama and Biden enforced for the first 7 years of their administration. They repealed it on their way out. And that's fine. It should have been repealed. But let's not act like this is some dystopian anti-LGBT. And I'm not saying you are, right? But you have people like the Human Rights Campaign, the most prominent LGBT rights group in America. They have said that Donald Trump is the most anti-LGBTQ president in American history. That's just ridiculous and unhinged, right? So much of the backlash in LGBT circles is so extreme that any kernel of truth at it, I almost have a hard time caring about. When you have, if you read the way that LGBTQ Nation or The Advocate write about Trump, I mean, Out Magazine published an article arguing that Trump's international diplomatic campaign to decriminalize homosexuality, spearheaded by Rick Grenell, is a classic racist tactic used to target Muslims. Right. So the reaction from this left-wing LGBT community that dominates the media sphere and the political advocacy sphere in Washington, D.C. to Trump has been so unhinged and over the top that I've had a hard time. I do make the criticisms when I feel they're warranted, but it's like I had a liberal radio host. Mine was blown when they asked me to grade Trump on LGBT issues. I was like B, maybe B minus. They were like, what? How is it not an F? He's because that's the narrative. That's where these people are at. And it makes it hard. The second point I want to touch on is something you said that I think is interesting because it gets to a broader difference between gay conservatives and gay liberals, which I assume you would count yourself. It's the difference between toleration and celebration. You said you think Trump tolerates people, but LGBT people, but he doesn't love them or celebrate them or whatever. That's all I want. I don't care about in an ideal world. Now I know that we don't live in an ideal world, so I do talk about being gay and make it part of who I am and advocate publicly. In an ideal world, it would be an afterthought. I don't believe in the idea that there's something celebratory or worthy of praise or liking the LGBT community. As you said, they shouldn't be liked, right? Because they're LGBT. They should be viewed as any other person. So I actually like what you're saying about Trump not particularly caring that these people are LGBT and just liking them because they're voters that are going to support him. To me, that sounds good. That sounds like progress, right? When LGBT people are viewed by him as just anybody else. And maybe we don't like the way he views people. He's all about loyalty and just wants people to support him, right? But if he's doing that across the board, that's a good sign, in my opinion. So those are the kind of the 2 points I would make in response to you.
Right, and I understand what you're saying with that too. And no, we shouldn't be approved of merely because we're gay. Absolutely not. And that's not what I'm talking about. It's how my issue is how this administration is dealing with and addressing specific LGBTQ issues. I do want to go back to one thing because you mentioned, and I read your articles about the transgender ban. You're a good writer. But the one thing and as you just mentioned, you say, well, Biden and Obama enforced the same law during their time in office. Well, here's how I view that. First of all, they made steps to change it. And also, when Obama came into office, rather than bringing the hammer down and demanding it's going to be my way or the highway, what I saw was, and in part, liberals were upset because he kept trying to reach across the aisle. He kept trying to involve. He wanted bipartisan legislation on many things, not just LGBT. But those first years and everything, my view was that he was trying to bring things together. So things didn't move super quick. No, they didn't. We didn't have marriage equality in a minute. We didn't have healthcare reform in a minute. We didn't have a lot of things in a minute because he was trying to, having been a senator, and Joe Biden having been a senator, what I saw was people trying to get things done in a manner that would be bipartisan. And I think over time they realized that a lot of things were not going to happen. Witness Mitch McConnell blocking a Supreme Court justice choice. But what I was going to say about the transgender thing is I know you say, well, they enforced the same law, so are they as bad as Donald Trump? And what I would argue is, at the end of the day, the difference for me is Obama, Biden worked to remove barriers. And they did. They lifted the transgender ban. That was their result. Donald Trump put that barrier back in place. I think it's disingenuous to equate the two because one removed a barrier, maybe not as quick as someone else might have liked, but they removed it. And Donald Trump put that
let me
barrier
respond
back
to that
in place.
real quick.
Yeah.
Just because you make a good point, and maybe I have equivocated it in some points, but it's not so much that I think the two are morally equivalent as much as I think it's very important context, right? I'm not really saying, I might have said it once or here or there, but I agree with you. The two are not morally equal, but the fact that, so when I talk about the Trump transgender ban, we're talking about people who are describing it as an evil, bigoted attack on the LGBT community. Mm-hmm. That is how it is portrayed in the liberal media and by LGBT activists. And I offer the Obama context just for context to show not that Obama was wrong. I don't really know what the political environment was like when he took office in 2009. Maybe that was the right decision for the reasons you're saying, to not repeal it right away. But my point is not so much Obama was evil too, as much as, hey, this context shows that this is not as extreme or radical a thing as you're making it sound like. So that's why I make the comparison.
Mm-hmm. I understand that. You know, you can go out on the internet and find long lists of the things that have been done to either diminish the community. From minutes after Donald Trump took office, the LGBTQ issues page was removed from the White House website. the work of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Just days later, they revoked the Obama administration's guidance detailing obligations to transgender students under Title IX. Striking data collection about LGBTQ people from the 2020 census. They didn't want us to be recognized in the census because if we're represented by numbers there, then that's how money gets allocated, and that's how money gets spent, and that's how a lot of policy is decided. There are so many things, whether large or small, depending on who you are, how it may register for you. License to discriminate that would allow medical personnel to claim a religious exemption and say, I don't approve of same-sex marriage, so I'm not going to treat a gay person or a lesbian person or a bisexual person. There's been a lot of things here that have affected. I mean, the license, the religious exemptions could allow employees at the Department of Veterans Affairs to not process paperwork for a surviving same-sex spouse if the proposed rule change was allowed to happen. There are a lot of these things. So it's not just.
So let's talk about them.
Sure.
So in one of my roles at the Washington Examiner over the last 2 years, one of the things I have done is gone through these lists and gone through these controversies when they come up and reported on them, investigated them, and written columns about them. So everything from the Labor Department rule to all sorts of these small policies, I have followed and tracked most of them. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that when you have these lists from ProPublica or HRC, 100 things the Trump-Pence administration has done to attack the LGBT community, 90% of them are bullshit or insignificant when you actually look at them. I can give you a couple examples, and I'm happy to discuss any specific policy. And I'm not going to defend all of them, right? There are some that are valid, but any specific policy you want, I can discuss it with you and explain whether or not it's really as bad as they say it is. A lot of the time, a vast majority, it's not. There was this big story reported by BuzzFeed and a bunch of other places about a year into the Trump administration that the Trump administration was working to strip the ability of gay couples to have their children have citizenship if they were born outside the United States. That story was fake. It was debunked. I debunked it. I looked into it, and it did not do any such thing, right? The gay couples in question had another pathway to apply. It was basically a bureaucratic change. They had another way they could get citizenship for their child. They just had to go through a different bureaucratic route. And more importantly, the Trump administration did not change the policy. It was in place from, I forget the exact year, but from when Obama was still president, right? That's the most glaring example. But a lot of them are, like when you look at these lists, man, they include ridiculous things. President Trump failed to acknowledge Pride Month the first year in office. Like, okay, I mean, these are on lists of attacks on the LGBT community, anti-LGBT. The first one you mentioned about the pages being stripped from the website. First of all, I don't really care. I don't think it's important. But also, it happened as a broad cleaning of thousands and thousands and thousands of pages like that are always deleted when a new administration takes over, right? The political appointees from the new administration clean out the house. So they picked on that specific one, but you could have found thousands of other subjects that were also wiped because they wiped most of the political stuff from the Obama administration. So, I mean, I'm not jumping down your throat, but I get very tired of these what feel like bad faith charges because they turn out in most cases to either be exaggerated or untrue.
Well, I understand what you're saying. Let me say this. For instance, just barely touching on the website thing, hours within the time he was sworn into office. Why isn't there another page about LGBT issues since that time? Why take it down? Why within hours? Why do that? What does it cost to be there? And then the second thing is regarding the Pride Proclamation. 8 years of Barack Obama in office, there was a Pride Proclamation. And I'm not saying, there has to be something for everyone, but my issue with the Pride Proclamation is his office did prepare a proclamation that June is Home Ownership Month. It is National Ocean Month. It is National African Caribbean Music Month. Amid all of that, what would it cost to issue a proclamation recognizing LGBTQ Pride Month? What does it cost? Either, and I don't mean just financially, but morally, ethically. He held up that flag during the campaign. He said he was going to be a president for all Americans. What does it cost to issue a proclamation just recognizing LGBTQ month?
Yeah, but the funny thing is, I agree with you. Maybe he should have done it. I guess what I don't see is why it's really a big deal. The cost is very minor, I agree, but so is the impact. I mean, it just doesn't seem to me like a thing that in the grand scheme of things matters or is worth outrage. But let me make this point to you. He did actually tweet, I think it was last year.
He tweeted last year,
summer.
Yes.
And they attacked him for it. All the LGBT organizations, the Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, several Democratic members of Congress, when he tweeted it, they attacked him and called him a fraud and said, your administration is anti-LGBT. So damned if you do, damned if you don't is the standard that he gets treated with on these issues more than most of the time.
Well, I would just argue back politely that the response was, after 2 years of his administration, with these actions, whether they're large or small, these lists that we're both talking about, whether large or small, they send a message. They send a message. And what he could do, when people gave him backlash about those tweets last year, it was to send a message back saying, acknowledge us, address our issues. Don't just send out 2 tweets, because that's all the time that we're afforded as part of the American public. I understand you saying you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Do something. He opposes the Equality Act. He opposes the Equality Act.
Yeah, so do I.
And why is that?
So, I mean, it's, you know as well as I do, it's a very complicated, lengthy bill. The definition of public accommodation that it establishes is far too sweeping, and it is not a law that allows for a pluralistic society. So I believe in religious liberty, and I believe the Equality Act violates the basic First Amendment right to religious liberty. It would, for example, force a private Catholic school to hire teachers who are openly gay and married and flout and reject Catholic teaching. I don't think that's right. I believe in non-discrimination in public schools and non-religious organizations. There's a bill called the Fairness for All Act, introduced by a Republican congressman, that adds these protections but makes carve-outs for religion. I believe in religious liberty because the same right that the Christian baker wants to have to not bake me a cake is the cake that I want to have if I run a shop and someone wants me to make Leviticus whatever, man shall not lay with man. I don't want to put that on a T-shirt or a cake or what. I want the First Amendment right to say, no, that service violates my conscience, and so I don't have to provide it. If I want that right, they've got to have that right. And the other thing, too, is some of it's we got to be practical. And the Equality Act is what I call a search and destroy approach to reconciliation of our country. It's not a plan that allows religious people and LGBT people to live side by side. It is a plan that takes the values of LGBT people and puts them above religious people and then forces it onto religious people. So what I think is that is a recipe to have a far-right anti-gay leader rise on the Republican right, to have a backlash, to have a country that is headed towards more division and possible fracture, right? You have to set up a framework in which people can live side by side, even though they have these profound and distinct differences, to have a pluralist society that's going to survive. So I don't support forcing nuns to cater a gay wedding. I mean, you know the examples or whatever. There's a million examples that come with the Equality Act. I actually wrote a USA Today op-ed about this, and it's been a while, so we'd have to go over it again. But I think you get the general sentiment of why I don't think it is an unreasonable position to not support the Equality Act. I think it is a debatable proposition.
Well, then we'll politely disagree on this, because I support it wholeheartedly, and I don't support the idea that we can do carve-outs, that someone's religious beliefs get to deny me services when they're open in the public forum, when they're open in the public square. I think if we allow LGBTQ, you keep using the words, it would force a school to hire a teacher. That's a framework and a language. And I would say it this way: it would keep schools from firing teachers because they're gay. And that's a different framework. I'm not looking at people being fired for not approving of something or hired because of what they are. I don't think the Equality Act requires any kind of employment. It merely says that you cannot be discriminated against in the employment arena for being gay. There's a difference between that and having to hire someone. Not quite. I think that there's a difference between forcing a company to hire someone, which is the way you're saying it, and just simply not discriminating against someone because they're LGBTQ. That's what I think.
They wouldn't be allowed to screen for their religion as a prerequisite of hiring them for their Catholic school, because in doing so would require discrimination.
Well, I think there are a lot of gay Catholics that might want to teach at a Catholic school because they admire and love their religion and they want to be an educator. And so, but because they're gay and because they want to teach at a Catholic school, perhaps, that thing.
Why do they want to teach at a school that has to be forced by the state through like the threat of force to do that? I mean, why that doesn't make sense. And also they can be gay and Catholic, but they are openly flouting what is objectively Catholic doctrine. So I don't object to the idea. Let me pose you a couple hypotheticals about the Equality Act, right? One of the most controversial things that it does is it declares any hospital or establishment providing medical services a public accommodation, which includes religious organizations and religious hospitals. Do you believe that a Catholic doctor at a Christian hospital, a private organization that's privately run, should be forced to provide a transgender person with hormone treatment, even if that violates their religion and they don't believe in transgenderism?
Well, I don't know anything in religion that actually addresses being transgender, but I think if you're going to be a medical facility and the main leading requirement of that facility is to care for people, I think if you're going to be open to the public square, I don't see forcing a particular doctor. I wouldn't walk into an office and knowing that this person opposes a particular thing. I'm not one of those people that thinks that we need to walk into everything and just make a point of something to make a point.
That's what the Equality Act sets up.
I disagree with you. I simply disagree.
Well, I mean, it does.
You're viewing it from that side. Brad, I think you're viewing it from one side of the equation and I'm viewing it from the other. I'm viewing it as providing equal rights for LGBTQ people, and you're seeing it as a forced procedure, as and I understand you're libertarian, which is about live and let live and blah, blah, blah. We see this from different sides of the equation.
Instead of beating the dead horse, so to speak, I kind of want to move on. I kind of want to ask Brad this question because I've seen some repugnant things said about you by social conservatives. That definitely breaks my heart. And with organizations such as like the American Compass, which it sort of it's a rejection of economic libertarianism and an embrace of social conservatism. Accompanied with there was this Atlantic article written by a Harvard law professor,
Adrian Vermeule.
Yep, Common Good Constitutionalism. Do you see like conservatism, like new conservatism, becoming a danger to minority or LGBT rights? And do you think that means the community has a duty to reject conservative thought, especially going forward? Or do you think that there's
So that's a very good point, because I am on the inside of that battle within the conservative movement between old school, what you could call loosely libertarian or classically liberal conservatives who believe in things like free speech, who don't believe in using the state. But then you have these kind of illiberal conservatives who want to establish a quasi-theocratic socialist state. And what I would say is absolutely, if that were ever to become the mainstream or dominant position in the conservative movement, that would be repugnant to everything I believe in. But right now, that is a fringe minority of some weirdo, trad, Catholic scholars that have no relevance or bearing to public opinion. So it's a fringe movement. I agree it's a severe ideological threat, but it's really not where the actual conservative movement is at all. If that were to change, then I guess I would cede your point.
And Randy, do you think the LGBT community has a duty to reject conservative thought, or do you think viability for conservative thought in the LGBTQ world?
Oh, I do. Yes, I think there's room for conservative views. I know they are in the minority. I don't think that, let me rephrase it with your original question. Does the LGBTQ community have a duty to reject conservative thought? No, not necessarily. I understand a lot of conservative thought and policy is important to many LGBTQ people, like Brad. And I think,
but they do reject it in practice. Most of them. You acknowledge that, right?
I'm not going to say they're majority Republican. It depends on the policy. I think it's hard to paint with a broad brush of, if you're a conservative, you should be this and blah, blah, blah. I know there are people who their voting practice is based a lot on how it affects their family business. Their voting practice centers around their income or their tax burden. There are people who their voting practice is centered on equal rights for LGBTQ people, or the way they see racial minorities treated in the country. So it's hard for me to cut apart and just go, either you're a liberal or you're conservative, and gays should reject conservatism. There are a lot of, I have several gay conservative friends who are big business people, and they vote their wallet. That's what's important to them. I have several liberal LGBTQ friends who they vote equal rights and how they're treated in the country, and how they feel the country is being treated as a whole. So I think, yes, LGBTQ people absolutely should be allowed to embrace conservative positions, but I'll add to this. If you're going to be vocal, if you're going to step into the public square, be ready for that. And people start talking about, well, First Amendment rights, I have a right to express myself. Everyone has the right to express themselves, as long as it doesn't harm someone. So, but always know that your right to express yourself doesn't mean my right to respond doesn't exist either. And so I personally like a polite discourse. I like people that can sit down and have a conversation. And I ask people a lot of questions all the time. I have my own podcast. I interview people, and I ask why all the time, or what, or how. I want people to explain things to me. And I don't sit down and argue with people about conservatism or liberalism. I want them to help me understand. If there's something I don't know, I'm happy to learn. Happy to. And so obviously when people's voices get raised and they get angry, or they start throwing around certain language, I don't approve of that. I see why people do it, because being polite doesn't get a lot of things done often. We see that on both sides of the political spectrum. These protests that are happening right now, if you ask a lot of these protests across the country, they'll tell you, we have tried to see change for years and years and years, and it's not happening. So we're protesting because they'll notice this. Again, I'm not promoting or supporting any violence or any damage to property. But that's why they do this. So my overreaching point, though, is yes, everyone can embrace whatever policies they like. And if you decide to raise your voice, that's great. Just know that someone else may have a response to it.
So I'd love to talk about that because I think that's an important subject. I am absolutely with you in that First Amendment protects my right to speak and it protects your right to yell at me for what I have to say. I get that. I don't think it's a violation of quote unquote free speech or the First Amendment the way that the LGBT community at large is hostile and intolerant towards gay conservatives, especially transgender conservatives. Oh my God. It's not a First Amendment issue. It's an issue of open-mindedness and tolerance. So we're not talking about the Constitution. We're just talking about a general disposition of, are you a tolerant, open-minded person? Do you respect other people's differences? And it sounds like you are. I mean, and I give you tons of credit for that, but most people are not. I mean, go look at how the LGBT media treats gay Republicans, the articles that it writes about Rick Grinnell. I mean, The Advocate published a piece saying that, what's his name? The tech billionaire, gay guy.
Yeah.
That he's not really gay because he's a Republican. So he's just a man who has sex with men, but he's not actually gay because he endorsed Donald Trump in 2016. So, and I mean, I can tell you when I was at my very leftist college campus, I was persona non grata in the gay community. I mean, people would message me and tell me to kill myself, or I was a traitor, or they started calling me the Fox News faggot after I went on Fox and Friends. So it's like, I'm not saying this is you. I'm not saying that at all. But there is a large swath of the politically active, very liberal LGBT people, the people that run the Human Rights Campaign and run the LGBT media outlets, that is so intolerant and hateful. I mean, the people at BuzzFeed and a bunch of other LGBT outlets started a media campaign to get Jude Deere, who's the deputy White House press secretary and gay, banned from all the gay bars in D.C., right? And that is evil and intolerant. I mean, I've had many articles written about me in the LGBT press, and they'll put like Queer Tea and Pink News put like the subhead, it will be like traitor or like self-hating gay says X. Like that is the disposition, not of the average gay person necessarily, but of the most politically active gay people and LGBT people, though it's usually white gay men, if we're being honest, who are running these institutions that claim to speak for the LGBT community. There is an intense hostility to people, even people like me, who I advocate openly in the conservative media for things like banning conversion therapy, for things like repealing the transgender military ban, because of my unrelated LGBT positions, because I favor capitalism and free markets and gun rights, and I'm anti-political correctness and so many things down the list. That's what they hate me for. More than my actual I mean, some people take issue with my LGBT views on some of them, sure. But the thing that they hate me for more often than not is unrelated. And that's where it becomes intolerant. I think you have a right to expect that a gay Republican supports gay rights. And if they truly don't, then they should be faulted for that. But if you think a gay person has to have your position on guns or your position on abortion or your position on economics or any of these things, then you are being homophobic. Even if you're gay, even if you're LGBT, you are saying that someone's identity has to control the way they think on unrelated issues. That's reductive, not progressive.
Well, I agree with you on the gun and abortion rights and all of that. My perception, though, is, and this is my perception, this isn't my position, my perception is I think when we see conservative LGBTQ people, especially in an environment like today where, and we view it differently as we've acknowledged about the positions and policies of the Trump administration, they see being conservative as being a traitor, or I say the word quisling, turning on your own people, not because of guns or abortion rights, but because the question turns into how can you support, and again, this gets to be broad brush again, how can you support the Trump administration, or how can you support the Republicans if they're doing this to the LGBTQ community? And that's how it gets perceived. I know
that perception is, how can anybody disagree with me? They must be evil because they disagree with me. And that is a sick mindset.
Well, but here's the thing, because you're talking about tolerance, and I know Alex had mentioned the Mid-Atlantic Leather article that you wrote. And so since he mentioned it, and we're talking about tolerance, do you think the premise of your article was tolerant of different people in the LGBTQ community? Because it didn't seem like it. It seemed like you used the word deviance and perversion, and that doesn't sound tolerant to me.
Yeah. If I was to rewrite the article, I would rethink a lot of the word choice. I've openly, publicly acknowledged that. Okay. There's a tendency in media that all journalists trends sometimes towards hyperbole or clickbait, sure. And I fell for it on that column. And so
I appreciate you saying that.
Were I to rewrite the column today, I would use very different language. But the actual position that I was saying is that this is counterproductive, and I don't appreciate the way that movement conflated. I have a very strong ideological objection to the conflation of gay identity to other things, right? So when you have LGBT pride marches sponsoring gun control and Planned Parenthood banners waving and being carried, it makes me very ideologically opposed when there is an attempt to lump in being gay with things that not all gay people support or agree with or share. Mm-hmm. And I think also there's a practical argument that tying LGBT to things like Leather Weekend, in my view, is very harmful to that specific incident. Maybe isn't hugely impactful in the grand scheme of things, mm-hmm. but this general trend in the LGBT community where they tie LGBT people's image to kind of crazy free-for-all sexual stuff, it hurts the image and the progress of acceptance, right? Because conservatives that I know, young conservatives who support gay marriage overwhelmingly, it's because they're like, oh, they're normal people just like us. Just let them live their life. I really reject the trend of tying it to all these other radical interests that whatever you think of leather, it should be straight and gay people who support leather. Their sexuality is irrelevant. Those are the people who want to do leather in the streets and have sex parties and post them on Twitter. It shouldn't have anything to do with sexuality. If it had just been a leather weekend and it didn't brand LGBT, that's what bothered me and what made me write about it, because I think it's counterproductive and I hate the conflation of things like that. I don't want to be tied to that. I don't want to be tied to sex parties with leather in a hotel advertised LGBT. Like, I don't want people to hear LGBT, hear that I'm a member of that community and tie me to that, because I don't do that. I don't have any affinity for that. I don't particularly appreciate or respect that. But so do you see, that is my main objection to it. And unfortunately, with that column, my poor word choice and language took away from the actual point, or the actual point of the argument, which basically got overlooked, and everyone was just like, you called us deviants, mm-hmm. which, fine, but the actual argument was not about that.
Well, let me just say, again, I know we're probably getting close to time here. I do want to say a couple of things. So first of all, your use of the word normal, which I'm not a fan of. I don't like the word normal because I know the inferment. See, we're normal, not like those people. And right there, what we get is division. And part of my overriding support of the LGBTQ community and every community is the fact that we accept people at face value and we don't worry about what is deemed normal, whether you're wearing polo shirts and khakis or whether you're wearing a leather harness. That's anyone's business. The second thing I'll say is what people do at Mid-Atlantic Leather, for instance, is behind closed doors. And it doesn't necessarily tie you, Brad, to the LGBTQ community. It has nothing to do with you. You're not taking part.
But it was also live streamed on social media and trending in DC with a hashtag where everyone was posting images of it. So I get that it was a private event behind closed doors, but it was very publicized.
Okay, but don't watch. If you don't like it, if you're gay, if you're straight, don't watch if you don't like it. If people don't like guns, I don't want to see guns in the street. But I'm not going to sit here and write an article saying, "Oh, guns." Look, there's a Second Amendment right to guns, so people are going to carry them. I believe that. But the overriding thing that I think we're talking about here, and the point I'm trying to make is, for me, reading your article, aside from some of the language like pervert and debauchery and deviance and all that, is it seemed to come across that we are worrying about what other people think. And that if people, I don't. And I think libertarians shouldn't be caring about what other people think.
Well, that's a misnomer.
Position. Okay, let me finish. I think we should not be caring about if someone wears a leather harness. I don't think we should be caring about what people do behind closed doors. I don't think we should feel that these things are specifically reflected on us. I'm a white blonde boy from Texas, but everything in Texas doesn't reflect on me. Everything blonde doesn't reflect on me. Everything gay doesn't reflect on me. I'm an individual. And I think everyone in society is an individual. So I would just say, and you're not asking for my advice, but I would just say to anyone listening, my thought is we shouldn't care about what people think, because when you care about what other people think more than what you feel and who you are, you lose.
So the point I'll quickly make is the argument that is made is you shouldn't care about this because you're a libertarian. It's a misnomer, because libertarianism is about government policy, and I would never and have never advocated for outlawing or regulating or restricting any of these things. Right? Absolutely not. I believe in freedom. However, I can still have opinions on it and speak about it.
Yeah.
So the libertarian thing is a misnomer to say you shouldn't hold that view because you're a libertarian. That's like saying I believe in decriminalizing drugs because I think it's bad policy, but I personally think drug use is immoral and wrong and would tell people they shouldn't do it. And that's the same thing. I mean, not the same extent, but that's the framework I'm suggesting that is what I was using for the analysis of this event, right? That I was never calling for the police to shut it down or DC to ban it or anything like that. I was simply voicing my personal opinions on it. So it has nothing to do with being a libertarian or not being a libertarian. And the question of, again, I guess I just think that what you're saying is very idealistic. And it sounds naive to say that it doesn't reflect because it shouldn't, and who cares about what people think? Well, I care about what people think because what people think translates to how they vote and what political positions they hold. And I think that if you want to see, and what I want to see, is an America where both parties broadly accept gay people and support a respectable level of freedom from government infringement, and everyone gets to live their life in peace. If you want to achieve that, you got to worry about what people think.
I understand your point. I'll just say I don't think we as a society should moderate our behavior based on what people may judge in societal terms. I just don't believe
you have to. I wish we didn't have to, but I think the realistic approach is that you have to.
We disagree.
Do you think the ostracization, social ostracization from the LGBT community for holding, like you say, dissident political beliefs, do you think it's necessary, or do you think it's too harsh?
Oh, I don't support that at all. I think it's horrible. I don't think you should be in any community, right? Whether it's black people saying that black Republicans are Uncle Toms, or gay people saying that gay people who support Trump are traitors. I don't believe in that, because honestly, at the end of the day, I think 99% of the issues in our politics are complicated enough that people of good faith can disagree. Whether it's abortion, right? I think abortion is immoral and takes a human life. But I also understand pro-choice people don't feel that way, and I don't think they're evil. I just think they're very wrong, right? I think it's an extremely complex philosophical and almost theological debate over abortion. So the idea that someone who disagrees with me is evil or and that's maybe not a good example, but like all issues in our politics that are so contentious are deeply complicated and have evidence and arguments on both sides. That's why they're still contentious and haven't been solved. So the idea that any issue is simple enough to condemn people who don't hold the same belief as you is very rarely true and almost always unfairly reductionist.
Yeah, I would just chime in and say I've seen harsh behavior on both sides. I've seen the way some in the media will treat conservative gay people. I've seen that. Like I said earlier, I'm one to sit down and talk and discuss and do all that kind of a thing. We don't have time to do that every single day with every single person in the entire country. I wish we did. It's really kind of what I enjoy. But that said, I've also seen condescending attitudes from conservative gay people that I know who are like, well, you're just silly and you're not taking life seriously and you should take economics more seriously. I've seen condescension on both sides in different forms, and I don't approve of it. I don't like it. I think part of what has fueled things even more in the past 10 years is the social media platforms that allow people to make statements from behind their phone or from behind their computer. They don't have to own their statements in public. A lot of things get said on social media. They feel emboldened on either side of the spectrum that they can say something and throw out some line or something that may be hurtful or may be not productive. And I'm not a fan of that. I would rather someone stand up and talk about what they do believe in rather than just take these public shots at people. But it's now become, and again, I'll take this back to the Trump administration. He's kind of, with his use of Twitter, he's kind of opened the door to how social media can be weaponized to a degree. I don't think we'll ever go back. I think the genie is out of the bottle on social discourse and how we treat each other. And that's part of the problem, I think, is that the people don't know how to speak to each other. We talk about, Brad, you mentioned, you don't believe in being politically correct. I believe in people being polite to each other. I don't think there's anything wrong with being polite. When I hear, I don't like being I don't like political correctness. What I hear is, well, I want to use the N word, or I want to be able to teach you
that's
how
not what I
want.
mean when I say
it. But people do. And I don't think you do mean that, Brad. I don't. But when people say I don't believe in political correctness, I just want to say, but could we just be polite? Is there anything wrong with being polite and having a civil discourse? So that's what I would say to that in terms of ostracization being too harsh and all of that.
As we wind up, because we're getting close to time, I was just wondering, does being a political advocate ever feel like exhausting to you guys? And do you do anything to relax or take your mind off of it for a bit, sort of as like a self-care?
I was born for the fray, so I've always been eager. I've always been an iconoclastic person, so I've always wanted to dive headfirst into debate, conflict. The toxicity can get overwhelming, and sometimes I have to step away from Twitter for 48 hours, and that's, I guess, the only thing I do. But honestly, if I didn't do it, and I didn't have very, very thick skin, I couldn't be in the job I'm in, and I'm sure that the same is true for you. But yeah, I guess the only thing I really do is sometimes you got to step away from the screens and just unplug, and then it'll all blow over and at least get back to normal.
I would agree with you on that on terms of unplugging. You have to do that, because if you just live with your face in a phone or a computer all day long on social media or Twitter, it can become extremely toxic. Do I find it exhausting? It's a good word for that. Not in a negative way, but it can be tiring. It can be exhausting fighting the good fight. And yes, I step away from my computer and I go out to my pool and I pour a glass of wine and I float. at sundown. And that shuts down my day for the end of the day. And I spend time with my husband. I'm happy that after 25 years of being with my husband, we spent last night without a TV on, and we talked for 3 hours until we fell asleep. I like my friends. I like discussion. I like conversation about other things. My first half of my career was as an actor on Broadway, and I still enjoy the arts greatly, and they thrill me. And it's one of the things I still write about a lot on the randyreport.com is the arts and how they make me feel alive and how they balance a lot of stuff in our heads. And so that's what I do, yes, because I do find a lot of this can be draining. And I agree with Brad, you have to unplug at times. You do. And come back recharged.
And how about any suggested readings for the listeners? Are there any books that really, I don't know, drove your political activism?
Brad?
I guess if I could get a liberal gay person to read one book, it would be Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell or Free to Choose by Milton Friedman. And even if you still are just as liberal, by the end you will understand why people can disagree with you on good faith on every issue related to regulation and the economy. That would be what I would throw out there, because those books were definitely transformative for me.
I'll name two books. One written some years ago, Michelangelo Signorelli's It's Not Over, because it was a really good read for me. And I thought he brought up a lot of important things. It was after the passage, legalization of same-sex marriage. And he was like, it's not done, everyone. It's not. And the other thing, I recently read and spoke to the author of a book called Come Out, Whoever You Are. And it talks about how coming out isn't something only gay people do, but other movements have taken on the process, the practice of coming out when they feel like they need to come out for various different movements, whether it's being fat shamed or being slut shamed or sex shamed or things like that. And people come out and how the process was, how the history of coming out in the gay community and how it was adopted by other movements. And I thought it was interesting. And I really enjoyed my chat with the author from UCLA.
So, Brad, do you want to get us started with some final thoughts?
Sure. I think the one thing I would try to stress to readers is that don't assume that most issues, just because they're LGBT issues or to you they are defined as LGBT rights, that anyone who doesn't support the position you support isn't necessarily coming from a good place. They very well could be. And a lot of these issues are complicated. So just because someone doesn't support them in the Equality Act doesn't make them a homophobe. Just because someone doesn't support legal gay marriage, and I sure do, does not make them a homophobe. These things are complicated, and people can have different values and different beliefs. And one of the things across the spectrum, right, because conservatives and Republicans do this too on other issues, is we've got to stop vilifying people. And I'm sure I've done it. You could go back and find tweets from me or that I would regret now or whatever. But we've really got to stop acting like any of these issues are so black and white or so simple that the other side must be evil if they disagree with us. And in particular relevance to this conversation, LGBT people in the community and the activists and the liberals need to realize that as applied to their more conservative or right-leaning LGBT compatriots.
Randy, do you want to?
Sure. Just really quickly, I'll say thanks for inviting the two of us to talk about this. And I appreciate Brad being so civil about all this. It's not often that I get to speak to someone in such a civil tone, so I appreciate it. I also want to say I'm glad that we're doing this in Pride Month. I am a proud gay person. I'm proud of everything that's happened to me in terms of being gay and my lesbian and bisexual friends, transgender friends. And I appreciate more than anything the progress that does happen rather than focusing on the negative things. Part of the Randy Report is noting the good things that happen in life and being a little uplifting, because the news cycle can bring us down. It can focus on the darkness. It can focus on the things that need to be fixed. It can focus on the problems. And every now and then I would like to see, I would just like to ask people to try and find a little more light in life. That's not to give up the fight, but I think that we should embrace a little more lightness in our lives. And I appreciate that every day there are good things happening and that we can celebrate those things. And I appreciate the fact that we all vote. And the last thing I'll say is please, everyone, vote this fall. Please, please, please vote.
Randy, Brad, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Brad, and thank you, Alex.
You too. Thanks for the respectful conversation, guys.
Yep.
You guys have a wonderful Pride Month.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider following our social media accounts to stay up to date on new developments in the show and to share your opinions. We'd like to give one final thank you to our guests today for taking the time to engage in productive conversation. We would like to also thank our sponsors, Young Voices.